The wind had a name for this kind of cruelty. It scoured the paint from the station house and drove grit into the creases of her eyes. She stood on the platform, a parcel that had been refused at the door, the string cut and the contents spilled for all to see. Her dress, the one she had saved, was the color of faded cornflowers, now dusted with the same dun-colored earth that covered everything. It clung to her like wet paper. She had been delivered, and she had been returned. Jedediah Vance, the man whose letters had promised a life, stood with his arms crossed. His face was a knot of disappointment. He had paid for a photograph, a promise of a woman with round cheeks and a sturdy frame, a woman for work and for bearing sons. He looked at the creature before him, thin as a fence rail, with eyes that held the deep, bruised color of a gathering storm, and he spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near her bare feet. "That ain't what I bought," he said, his voice loud enough for the gathering onlookers. The station master wrung his hands. A few women from the town proper, their faces pinched with piety, murmured behind their gloved hands. She did not speak. Her throat was a knot of dust and shame. Her gaze was fixed on a loose board in the platform, tracing its grain, counting the splinters. To look up was to meet their eyes, to see herself reflected in their judgment. She was a curiosity, piece of damaged goods. The crowd shifted, their interest waning like the afternoon sun. They had their story for the evening meal, the failed mail-order bride, the girl left on the platform. Soon, only the wind and the lengthening shadows would be her companions. She pulled a thin shawl tighter, a useless gesture against the cold that came not from the air, but from the vast empty space that had opened up around her. He saw it all from the doorway of the mercantile. Elias Thorne had seen men broken by the land, by drought, by God. He had never seen a person unmade so quietly, so completely, in the middle of a dusty street. He had come to town for salt and seed, a trip he made only when the emptiness of his cabin pressed in on him too hard, when the silence started to speak in his dead wife's voice. He watched the Vance fellow swagger away, leaving the woman standing alone. She was a statue carved from bone and resignation. Her stillness was what caught him. It was a stillness he recognized, the kind that comes after the screaming stops. He had a poster folded in his coat pocket, worn soft at the creases. A drawing of a woman wanted for theft in a county 2 states east. Lena McCall, slender build, dark eyes. Last seen heading west, he had picked it up out of habit, the way a man checks the weather. He looked from the poster in his memory to the woman on the platform. The resemblance was there under the grime and the fear. The same high cheekbones, the same haunted shape to the eyes. The artist had not captured the hollowness, though. No one could draw that. He carried whole winters in his eyes, but something in her quiet despair chipped at the ice. It was not pity. Pity was a useless emotion, a weak tea that warmed no one. This was something else. A flicker of recognition, a shared language of loss. He pushed away from the doorframe, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. The few remaining townspeople watched him, their curiosity rekindled. Elias Thorne kept to himself. His grief was a high wall around his homestead. For him to approach the abandoned woman was a spectacle. He stopped a few feet from her, careful not to crowd her space. She did not look up, but her shoulders tensed, a bird preparing for a stone. He saw the cracked skin of her knuckles where she gripped her small, worn bag. He did not offer a name or a greeting. He simply stood there, a bulwark against the stairs. The wind picked up, whipping her threadbare dress against her legs. He waited until the last of the onlookers, disappointed by the lack of drama, had drifted away. Only then did he speak, his voice low, a sound that seemed to come from under floorboards. "The sky's turning." She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Her gaze remained fixed on the wooden planks. "A storm's coming. A bad one." He continued, not to her, but to the air between them. No place to be, a platform. He held out a hand, palm up. It was not a gesture of comfort, but a simple offering. In it lay a few coins. Not enough to buy a ticket anywhere that mattered, but enough for a meal. She flinched as if expecting a blow. "I have a farm," he said, his voice steady. "Work to be done. A roof. You can earn your keep." It was not a proposal of marriage or of rescue. It was a transaction, as stark and practical as the landscape around them. He was offering a different kind of cage, perhaps, but one with an open door. He needed help. She needed shelter. The truth was more complicated, tangled up with the face on the poster and the ghost in his cabin. But the words were simple. For the first time, she lifted her head. Her eyes, shadowed and deep, met his. She searched his face, looking for the hook in the bait. She found nothing but a tired sort of honesty, a weariness that matched her own. Her gaze dropped to the coins, then back to his face. She did not take the money. She gave another slow nod. It was all the answer he needed. He turned and started walking toward his wagon, not looking back to see if she followed. He knew she would. There was nowhere else for her to go. The journey was a silent conversation with the land. The wagon wheels groaned, cutting twin lines in the deep dust that lifted behind them like pale ghosts. He kept the horses to a steady walk. She sat on the buckboard beside him, rigid, her hands clutching her bag in her lap. The sky ahead bruised, turning a sickly yellow-brown at the horizon. The wind grew teeth, biting at their faces, carrying the taste of grit and distance. Elias kept his eyes on the trail, his hat pulled low. He could feel her shivering, a fine tremor that ran through the wooden seat between them. He did not speak. Words were clumsy tools for a moment like this. Instead, he reached behind him and pulled out a heavy wool blanket. It smelled of horse and hay and the faint, clean scent of the lye soap Sarah had once made. He held it out to her. She stared at it for a long moment before her hands, slow and uncertain, reached out to take it. She wrapped it around her shoulders, her movements stiff. The trembling eased. It was the first kindness. As they cleared the last rise before his property, the storm broke. It did not rain. The sky fell. A wall of churning brown dust descended upon them, swallowing the sun, the horizon, the world. The air grew thick, choking. It became impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Elias pulled the horses to a halt, their ears flattened, their eyes wide with panic. "Get down!" he shouted over the roar of the wind. "Under the wagon." He helped her down, his hand firm on her elbow for a moment, a brief, impersonal contact. They huddled in the shallow space beneath the wagon bed, the wheels offering a meager fortress against the onslaught. The world was reduced to a screaming, brown twilight. Dust filled his nose, his mouth. He could hear her coughing, a dry, racking sound. Section. Without thinking, he pulled the bandana from his neck and pressed it into her hand. "Breathe through this." She took it, her fingers brushing his. In the swirling gloom, he saw her press the cloth to her face. They sat in silence, backs against the spokes of a wheel, while the prairie tried to bury them. The wind howled a long, mournful note. He felt a strange sense of peace in the heart of the chaos. Here there was no past, no future. Only the howl of the wind and the small, breathing presence beside him. It was a long time before the fury passed. The homestead was carved into the land, not built upon it. The house was made of sod and weathered timber, its shoulders slumped against the constant push of the wind. A crooked fence enclosed a patch of stubborn ground where a garden had once fought and lost. A lone cottonwood tree stood sentinel, its leaves turned silver with dust. As the dust storm receded into a hazy gloom, Elias led the tired horses to the barn. The woman, he did not know her name and did not ask, followed him, a shadow in the eerie light. She moved with the slow, deliberate steps of someone saving their last ounce of strength. The barn was dark and cool, smelling of hay and animals. It was a place of work, of life. He unhitched the team, his movements economical and sure. She stood by the doorway, wrapped in his blanket, watching. She did not offer to help. He did not expect her to. When the horses were tended, he led her to the house. The door creaked open into a single room. A stone hearth dominated one wall, cold and dark. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed, neatly made, occupied one corner. In the other, a smaller cot. The air inside was still and heavy, thick with memories. He gestured toward the cot. "That's yours." She looked at the cot, then at the larger bed. Her eyes asked a question she would not voice. "I don't lock my doors," he said, answering the unspoken fear. His gaze drifted to a small, faded photograph on the mantelpiece. A smiling woman with kind eyes. "Sarah, the other room it's closed." He turned from the photograph and moved to the hearth. He laid a fire with practiced hands, striking a match to the kindling. The small flame caught, pushing back the shadows, breathing a fragile warmth into the space. The firelight danced across her face, revealing the stark lines of exhaustion. He filled a basin with water from a bucket, his back to her. He set it on the table. "You can wash up." He walked out of the cabin then, giving her the privacy of the room. He stood on the porch, watching the last of the storm clouds moving east, leaving behind a sky scrubbed clean and raw. The air was cold now, washed. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. He wasn't sure what he had done. He had brought a stray into his home. A woman with a price on her head. A woman who looked like she might break if the wind blew too hard. He thought of the wanted poster, of the name Lena McCall. He looked back at the closed door of his cabin. He had not rescued a woman. He had invited a reckoning. When he went back inside, she was sitting on the edge of the cot, the blanket still around her shoulders. She had washed her face. In the firelight, her skin was pale as milk. He moved to the small pantry, taking out a heel of bread and a piece of dried meat. He sliced them with his knife and put them on a tin plate. He set the plate on the table, not before her, but in the middle. He poured 2 cups of water. He sat in one chair and waited. After a long silence, she rose and moved to the other chair. Her movements were fluid and silent. She sat down and took a piece of the bread, her eyes downcast. They ate without speaking, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind around the eaves of the house. The unspoken contract was sealed. Food, shelter, safety. For now it was enough. The days settled into a rhythm, marked not by the clock but by the sun and the needs of the land. They moved in parallel orbits, a quiet dance of shared labor. He would rise before dawn, his boots echoing on the floorboards. When he returned from the barn, she would be awake, the fire rekindled, a pot of thin coffee boiling on the hearth. She did not speak, but she learned the shape of his life. She swept the packed earth floor until it was smooth. She mended the torn sleeve of his shirt with small, neat stitches, leaving it folded on his chair while he was out. He found her one afternoon by the small, mounded grave behind the house, marked by a simple wooden cross. She had pulled the weeds from around it and placed a single, stubborn prairie wildflower at its base. He never acknowledged these small acts, not with words. But the next day, he spent the morning fixing the handle on the water pump, which he knew had been stiff and difficult for her to use. He left a new bar of soap, smelling faintly of lavender, by the wash basin. It was a conversation held in gestures, a language of unspoken kindness. He would watch her sometimes, when she thought he was not looking. He saw the way she moved, with a quiet efficiency that belied her frail appearance. There was a strength in her, coiled deep. He would see her pause in her work, her gaze fixed on the vast, empty horizon, and for a moment, the mask of resignation would fall away, revealing a profound and aching loneliness that mirrored his own. He still kept the wanted poster, tucked away in his worn leather wallet. Some nights, by the light of the fire, he would take it out. He would look at the drawing, then at the sleeping woman on the cot across the room. The lines were the same, but the person was different. The drawing was of a criminal, a name, a crime. The woman on the cot was a quiet presence, a warmth in the hollow space of his house. She was the humming of a forgotten tune as she kneaded dough. She was the careful way she stacked the firewood. She was real. The poster was a lie. One evening, a week or maybe 2 into her stay. He had lost track of the days. He woke from a dream of fire. He sat bolt upright on his bed, his heart hammering against his ribs, the smell of smoke sharp in his nostrils. The old terror, the one that always waited for him in the dark, had him in its grip. The image of the burning barn, the screams he could not reach. Sarah, his son. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his head in his hands, breathing hard. The house was silent, save for the whisper of the dying embers in the hearth. He looked over at the cot. She was awake. In the faint, red glow he could see her sitting up, watching him. Her eyes were wide in the darkness, full of a knowing fear. He expected her to look away, to pretend she had not seen his weakness. But she did not. She simply watched, a silent witness to his unraveling. He fought for control, pushing the memories down, locking them away. He stood, his movements jerky, and went to the water bucket, splashing his face with the cold water. He did not go back to bed. He stoked the fire and sat in his chair, staring into the flames. After a few minutes, she rose from her cot. She moved to the hearth, her bare feet silent on the floor. She took a cup, filled it with water, and placed it on the small table beside his chair. Then, just as silently, she returned to her cot and lay down, turning her back to him. The gesture was so simple, so profound. It was not pity. It was understanding. It was an acknowledgement of his pain, offered without a single word. He sat there for a long time, the cup of water untouched beside him, watching the flames. He felt a crack in the ice that had encased his heart for 2 long years. The next morning, he took the wanted poster from his wallet. He walked to the hearth, where the fire still glowed with morning embers. He looked at the face of Lena McCall one last time. Then he tossed the poster into the flames. He watched as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. Fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. He turned to look at the woman, who was kneading dough at the table, her back to him. He did not know her name, but he knew she was not the woman on the poster. He had made his choice. The thaw came slowly, like the first green shoots of spring on the prairie. It came in small, almost imperceptible moments. It came in the way she started to meet his gaze, just for a second, before looking away. It came in the way he started leaving the door to Sarah's room ajar, letting the light in. One evening, she served him a stew that was richer and thicker than his own sparse cooking. He took a bite. It was good. He took another. "The bread was a little dry yesterday," she said, her voice quiet, hesitant. It was the first time she had spoken a full sentence that was not a simple, functional reply. He looked up, surprised. He chewed slowly, considering. "You didn't complain about mine." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, a fragile, fleeting thing. "Yours died in vain." He felt an answering smile tug at his own mouth. A small, rusty thing. "This is good stew. I found some wild onions by the creek," she said, looking down at her plate. The conversation was small, mundane, but it felt momentous. It was a bridge built across the chasm of their shared silence. They were no longer just 2 people sharing a space. They were stitching a life together with raw, clumsy thread. The community, what little there was of it, had not forgotten them. When Elias went to town for supplies, he felt their eyes on his back. The whispers followed him like dust devils. He was living with the woman Vance had cast off. The woman who had arrived with nothing. They saw sin. They saw foolishness. Mr. Henderson, the mercantile owner, cleared his throat as he bagged Elias's flour. "Heard you got some help out at your place, Elias." "I do," Elias said, his voice flat, offering nothing more. "Vance is telling folks all sorts of things," Henderson pressed, his eyes full of a greedy curiosity. "Says she's half wild. Says you're a fool to take in another man's leavings." Elias's knuckles turned white where he gripped the edge of the counter. He met Henderson's gaze, his own eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "She's a hard worker. And my farm is my business." His voice was low, but it cut through the low murmur of the store. What Jedediah Vance does with his mouth is his. The message was clear. He had drawn a line around his homestead, around her. He was defending her honor, and in doing so, defining her as something to be honored. The whispers did not stop, but they grew quieter, more cautious. She must have heard the rumors too, carried on the wind or in the averted eyes of the few people they passed on the trail. She grew quieter for a few days, her movements more tentative. He found her one evening, standing on the porch, staring out at the blood-orange sunset. "Why?" she asked, her voice so soft he almost did not hear it. "Why did you take me in?" He stood beside her, not looking at her, but at the horizon. He thought of the poster, of the law he had broken. He thought of the emptiness of his house, of the silence that screamed. He thought of the wildflower on Sarah's grave. "The ground is hard here," he said, his voice rough. "A man can't work it alone." It was the truth, but not the whole truth. It was the only truth he could offer. She seemed to understand the words he did not say. "You are either the kindest man I have ever met," she said, her gaze still on the sunset, "or the most foolish." He allowed himself a small, dry smile. "Can't I be both?" She turned then, and for the first time, she truly looked at him, her eyes clear and direct. There was no fear in them, only a quiet, searching gravity. And in that look, something shifted. The ground beneath their feet, once so hard and unforgiving, felt a little more solid. The past arrived on a Tuesday, carried on the backs of 3 horses. Elias saw the dust cloud first, a telltale plume rising from the east. It was too deliberate for a whirlwind, too purposeful for stray cattle. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He was mending a fence post, and he stopped, his hand resting on the weathered wood, and watched them come. She came out of the house, a basket of laundry on her hip. She saw the riders, and she saw the look on his face. The color drained from her cheeks. She set the basket down slowly, her movements becoming unnervingly still. The wind turned mean, pulling at her hair, whipping her apron against her dress. The land itself was holding its breath. It was Jedediah Vance. He rode in front, his chest puffed out with a borrowed authority. The 2 men with him were hired muscle, their faces blank and brutish. They reined in their horses just outside the newly mended section of fence, turning the homestead into a battleground. "Thorne," Vance called out, his voice slick with smugness. "I've come for my property." Elias walked slowly to stand between Vance and the house. He did not reach for the rifle that leaned against the porch rail. His posture was calm, his hands loose at his sides. He was a mountain. He would not be moved. "She's not your property, Vance," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying on the wind. "She never was." "I got a contract," Vance sneered, patting a pocket on his coat. "Paid her passage. She belongs to me. Law says so." He looked past Elias, his eyes fixing on the woman. His gaze was possessive, insulting. "I've decided I'll have her after all. Heard she cleans up nice." The woman flinched as if struck. She took a half-step back, toward the safety of the house. Elias's jaw tightened. He could feel the violence coiling in him, a hot, dangerous thing. But he held it back. To fight Vance on his own terms was to lose. "The law also says you abandoned her," Elias said, his voice remaining level, steady. "Left her on a platform for anyone to see. You declared her worthless. That declaration has been accepted." Vance's face reddened. "You think you can hide behind fancy words? I came to take what's mine." Step aside, one of the hired men shifted in his saddle, his hand drifting toward the pistol on his hip. Elias did not move. He stood his ground, a silent, unyielding presence. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them, a charged and dangerous silence. And then, something changed. From behind Elias, she stepped forward. She moved to stand beside him, not behind him. Her fear was a visible thing, a tremor in her hands, but she stood tall. She lifted her chin and looked directly at Jedediah Vance. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was clear and sharp as shattered glass. "My name," she said, "is Lena." The word hung in the air, a stone thrown into a still pond. It was a claiming, an act of defiance more powerful than any weapon. She was no longer the object of their dispute. She was a person. She had a name. Vance stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He had expected tears, begging, a cowering creature he could drag away. He did not know what to do with this woman who stood beside her protector, her eyes burning with a cold fire he had never seen before. "I am not your property," Lena said, her voice gaining strength. "I am not a parcel to be delivered or returned. I am here because I choose to be." That was when Elias moved. He took one step forward, and the simple motion was laden with menace. His eyes never left Vance's. "You heard the lady," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "She has made her choice. Now you can make yours. You can turn your horses around and ride away, or you can be carried away. It makes no difference to me." The two hired men looked at Vance, then at Elias. They saw no fear in him. They saw only a promise of swift, terrible violence. They were paid to bully, not to die. One of them subtly shook his head at Vance. Jedediah Vance, stripped of his bluster, was nothing but a petty, prideful man. He looked from Elias's cold fury to Lena's defiant stance. He saw the way they stood together, a unified front. He was defeated, not by force, but by a strength he could not comprehend. He spat on the ground, a final, pathetic gesture of contempt. "You can have her," he snarled. "Damaged goods. The both of you." He yanked his horse's reins, turning it so sharply the animal protested. He galloped away, his hired men trailing behind him, leaving a cloud of dust and humiliation in his wake. Elias and Lena stood together, watching them go. They did not move until the riders were nothing but a speck on the horizon. The wind died down, as if it too were releasing a held breath. The silence that settled over the homestead was different now. It was not empty. It was peaceful. Elias turned to her. He saw the lingering tremor in her hands, the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently closing around her wrist. It was not a gesture of ownership, but of connection, a silent acknowledgement of the battle they had just won together. "I was scared," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know," he said softly. His thumb brushed against her pulse, a steady, reassuring rhythm. "You didn't run." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "Neither did you." He let go of her wrist and bent down to pick up the fallen laundry basket. He handed it to her. The simple, domestic act was a return to their life, to the routine they had built. But everything had changed. The house behind them no longer felt like his house, felt like theirs. That night, the air in the small cabin was different. It was charged with the unspoken things, the aftermath of the storm they had weathered together. After their silent meal, he did not retreat into his chair to stare at the fire. She did not immediately retreat to her cot. He looked at her across the table, at the way the firelight softened the tired lines around her eyes. "Lena," he said. It was the first time he had spoken her name. Felt right on his tongue. Felt like putting the last perfect stone in place on a foundation. She met his gaze, and for the first time she smiled. A real smile, not the ghost of one. It transformed her face, chasing away the last of the shadows. "Elias," she said, speaking his name in return. It was a vow, promise, a beginning. He reached into the pocket of his worn coat and pulled out a small object. He placed it on the table between them. It was a whittled bird, carved from a piece of cottonwood, its lines smooth and simple. He had been working on it in the evenings, a quiet task to keep his hands busy. She picked it up, her fingers tracing its wings. It was a clumsy, imperfect thing, but it was beautiful. It was a gift. The old life was a ghost, a story that had happened to someone else. The wanted poster was Ash. The man who had tried to claim her was a coward fading into the dust. What was left was this room, this fire, this quiet man who had seen her at her lowest and had not looked away. She stood and walked to the empty space on the mantelpiece, next to the faded photograph of Sarah. She placed the small wooden bird there. It did not replace what was lost. It stood beside it, a symbol of a new life, built alongside the memory of the old one. The house, which had been a hollow thing of grief and silence, breathed again. It breathed with the quiet promise of a future. The final image was one of peace. Weeks later, or maybe months, time had softened, flowing like a slow river. They sat together on the porch steps, watching the sun set. The air was cool and sweet. A new, green blanket of grass had begun to cover the patch of earth by Sarah's grave. The fence was whole. He had a cup of coffee in his hands. She was mending a shirt, her needle moving in a steady, rhythmic dance. They did not need to speak. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a comfortable, shared space. It was filled with the knowledge of chores done, of meals shared, of dangers faced together. It was filled with the quiet certainty of her place beside him, and his beside her. The house behind them was warm, its windows glowing like amber eyes in the twilight. It was a home. This story, it ain't just about a man saving a woman from a storm, or from a cruel fool who thought he could own a person. It's about the fact that sometimes the most wanted thing in the whole world isn't gold or retribution. It's a second chance. It's a quiet place to heal. It's about recognizing the person behind the poster, the soul behind the shame. It's about the quiet courage it takes to burn the past and build a future from the ashes, with nothing but calloused hands and a stubborn hope. We all have our own wanted posters, our own pasts that dog our heels, our own platforms where we've been left standing alone. So here's your naming. It's the moment you decide you are more than what's been done to you. It's the quiet voice that says, "My name is," and fills in the blank with your own truth. It's the choice to stand your ground, not with fists, but with the unshakable certainty of your own worth. And if you're brave enough to offer a little shelter, and if you're brave enough to accept it, you might just find that the person you save is yourself. You might just find that even on the hardest patch of ground, something beautiful is waiting to grow.